everybody, welcome to the second part in this series, in this Udemy course, D5 Render and Interior and Exterior Guide. In this second part, we're going to concentrate on doing a realistic commercial render of a realistic property within D5. We've already looked at doing an interior render, and now we're going to build an exterior from scratch. The first thing that you will need to do is to get a floor plan. Now, there are plenty of readily available and free floor plans available online, or if you're just doing this for practice, feel free to grab one using a screen capture technology and use that to design your house. Remember, if you are going to build commercial renders effectively for profit, please be mindful that you will have to be considerate of copyright, and you should go ahead and purchase those plans. For our purpose, we're going to use a floor plan that I've got from online, and we're going to build our Sketchup model on top of that floor plan. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So you can see here, I've gone ahead and dragged in a floor plan into SketchUp. Now, you can easily do this, just open the image, left click, and drag it into SketchUp, but please note, this will only work with JPEG images, or at least that's what I've had the most success with. So if you've downloaded an image from online or you've grabbed one from online, it might help you to open it up in Photoshop or using the free photo editor Photshop, which is available online for free, and go ahead and save this as a JPEG. Now, I'm going to hit M on my keyboard. I'm going to drag this over to really the central area, close to the origin point. And the important thing now is to get correct scale. So we can see my floor plan has come in, but I don't really know how the scale relates to everything else. Now, I can see here that we have at least a bedroom that has a 10 feet wall. So I'm going to assume that this is probably this wall running right here, but you could probably go with almost any of these. And so what we need to do is establish that in SketchUp. I'm going to go up here to the left, grab the line tool, and I'm going to click here, somewhere in the center of the wall, and I'm going to look on the bottom right where it says the length, and I'm going to keep drawing this up until I get to about 10. All right, that's close enough. Left click once, left click again, and I'm just going to redraw this all the way back to effectively where I started. Now, I know that that is, as far as SketchUp is concerned, 10 feet. I'm going to also make this a pretty red color. Yeah, let's do something like this. You want to pick a color that you can see pretty easily. Okay, that looks good. And now, what I'm going to do is hit S on my keyboard, and I'm going to start scaling this up. And you can see I'm going by SketchUp's internal scale, and I've got to go a little bit further. Just keep going until these effectively match up. Okay, and I'm just going to keep moving this just a little bit. It is a little bit bouncy, but a little bit more will get us there. So let's go ahead and just keep scaling a little bit more. And I think I want to make sure that these stay flush. You want to make sure that it doesn't bounce around too much. Let's go ahead and just take it up a little bit more. Now, I think that's pretty nice. I think that's, close enough. We could probably scale things a tiny dash more, but sometimes close enough is going to be close enough. All right, that looks good. All right, with that being said, now is a good time to save because you've gone ahead and established the correct scale within SketchUp. All right, let's move on. Okay, now that we have our internal scale and it's pretty logical and kind of makes sense, we're able to go ahead and start drawing on the floor plan. To do this, you can use either the rectangle tool or use the line tool, but I'm going to suggest that you actually use the line or pen tool here. Okay, so what we're going to do is find a good starting point, which I think this looks pretty good. I'm going to left click here, left click, and I'm going to start working my way around the floor plan. Effectively, we're going to trace on top of the floor plan. Now that looks pretty nice. I'm going to pick a different color, one that hopefully you guys will be able to see no problem. And I'm going to go ahead and just paste that in. Let's maybe make it a little darker. There, that looks really nice. Now, once this is done, we're going to continue tracing over the floor plan. And I'm going to left click and left click and left click. Now, you may notice it might be off by a little bit, but that's okay. We can adjust all this later. Now, the reason I mentioned to use the pen tool over the rectangle tool comes down to this. You can hover your mouse here and drag to the right, and Sketchup will keep it locked on effectively the correct axes. And you know it'll be accurate because these should line up nicely. There we go. I've gone ahead and made another piece. And as you keep working over this, feel free to go ahead and grab the paint bucket tool and actually color in your floor plan. You can also clean up any stray edges that you have. For example, this one right here, and try and keep the floor plan consistent. Okay, when we get to a gap like this, just know that this is going to be either a window or door or something similar. You can definitely just draw a little line like that across, but always go back to endpoint to new start. So there we go, keep going across. And if you want, you could probably leave these completely empty. It's kind of up to you how you want to work. My advice would be to go ahead and trace the exterior walls first, and be mindful that when you do that, if you make small mistakes, so for example, this wall is a little bit off or not completely flush, when you get to the point where we're pushing and pulling the walls up, try and remember to go back and fix these. I would recommend fixing them as you draw them, but just know that if you do run into a situation where they don't line up perfectly, you can always use the push-pull tool in SketchUp to snap your walls correctly. But when in doubt, try and fix it in SketchUp before you go very far. So I'm going to keep working these walls. And here's a great example. That doesn't line up perfectly, but once we get to where we're using the push-pull tool, you should be able to go in here and make this seamless. There we go. That looks pretty nice. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and continue building the floor plan using this technique, and I'll see you in the next video. Please note that you have to ignore when doing this, the bedroom icons, the doors, anything else that's in the scene, and just concentrate on the walls, the big ones on the exterior and the little smaller ones on the interior. Okay, everyone, so now you can see I've gone ahead and traced over my floor plan. For the sake of expediency, I am going to just ignore this second story in our build. And I've left a few little mistakes that we can take a look at really quickly just to see how you can clean them up. The first is to make sure that all of the traced SketchUp content is actually cleaned up. So let's go in here and erase this line there. And you can see if it goes the color that you assigned it, that's a sign that it's working correctly. All right, if it goes white like this, there we go. Clean up the secondary edge. I'm going to do the same up here as well. You'll also notice that we have a little area that's problematic here. An easy way to fix that is to just go ahead and click here, and I'm just going to move my mouse up to about here and try and take that across. Now, it might not be perfectly even, but once you have that capped, you can draw a fresh line and erase the exterior, and now that should sit pretty nice and snug. I've also got one or two stray edges that are worth looking at and cleaning up, and areas where these may not line up perfectly. So the next thing to do is to go ahead and start giving thickness to our walls. Now, this is a part that might very much depend on where you are and what you're designing. In America, it used to be that the ceiling height for interior rooms used to be about 8 feet, and then it went up to 9, and increasingly you're seeing interior room height going up really up to about 12 in some cases. So for our purposes, we're going to just try and make a reasonable guess, and I'm going to go ahead and lift this section right here up about 9 feet, and then we'll take a look and see how that looks. So I'm going to use push-pull, or I can hit tab on my keyboard, type in 9 apostrophe, which is 9 feet, hit enter, and that will bring us up. And I think that looks pretty reasonable for a single-story interior dwelling house. I think that's pretty good. I think we'll do that on the rest. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just left click and drag up the remaining walls. I'm going to use inferencing or snapping so that SketchUp actually lifts these up to the right corresponding height across the model. So running over really quickly and just keep dragging up these surfaces. Now be mindful that you may have a situation where some of these rooms or some of the pieces that are built into the floor plan are not necessarily going to be as tall as everything else, but you can always fix that later. And remember as well, this is exterior render. So we're more concerned with how the building is going to look from the front and from the 3/4 side and possibly even the back, but not necessarily all of the interior content. The reason we're building it off the floor plan is just to help with accuracy, and because people have a tendency to build houses how they think they're built, but that's not always accurate. Now, we can also see you may have a situation where walls don't line up with the right perfect amount of thickness. For example, this one may be a little bit larger. You can always use SketchUp's push-pull to inference or snap to the edge of a corresponding wall, and now we know that this will be very flush. Okay, that looks pretty good, and this is a good point to bounce into the next video. Now, the next thing we're going to do is create a floor. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click and just hide the floor plan. We don't need it for now. And I think all of that looks pretty good. And looking at our model from underneath, you can see we do have a few areas that are hollow. So if this happens to you, just hit L on the keyboard and go ahead and close that out. And I'm going to apply the same color, hit E on the keyboard. And yeah, I think that all in all, that looks okay. Let's make sure we can erase some of these stray edges. That looks pretty nice indeed. Okay. I'm going to change my style here back to one of the sort of default or styles that aren't as sort of difficult to work with. All right, we've also got another little hole here. So let's go ahead and cap that if we can. And so this is a great example of where you can kind of see that the floor plans didn't line up perfectly. And so we're getting a little bit of stray geometry going on. So I'm just looking at how we can fix this. Let's go ahead and draw a line from here directly across to here and then straight up. And I'm going to see, can we get SketchUp to cap this for us? And this does happen every now and then when you're working with, when you're kind of drawing on lines within SketchUp, there's always a chance that, you know, your image, you might overlap a line or something like that will happen. So go ahead and just see, can you cap it like that? And I think that will work. There's a little bit of a problem here. We've lost some, yeah. So this line here, I think if we bring back our floor plan and unhide that, yeah, we need to push pull. This line needs to come out. There we go. And I need to just cap this one more time. So this does kind of happen every now and then. Sometimes SketchUp will, you'll erase a line and you get some kind of quirks will come with your model. Okay, for the most part, I think that looks pretty fine. We've got a little bit of overlapping geometry, but it shouldn't be a problem. So let's go ahead and select these two guys here. I'm going to hide the floor plane and I'm going to hide that. I'm going to go ahead and hide our scale reference as well. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and drag a selection over this whole thing, right click, and make it a group. Hit L on the keyboard, and we shall go and cap this by drawing lines all around. Now, you're actually drawing lines on the group, not on the, basically not on the walls themselves. So then we can do is, you can see SketchUp fill that in nicely for us. I'm going to hit Control, use the alternative push-pull, and drag out what is effectively just the foundation of our build. And I'm going to drag this out just a little bit. Let's go, that should be nice. It's about 1.5 feet. I think that will work perfectly well for our purposes. Yeah, I think that's pretty nice. And the joy of this is the walls themselves, if we select them, we can hide them because they are grouped. I'm going to go ahead and select the floor, the foundation, right click, and I'm going to make that a group. In addition, I'm going to go ahead and apply a wood flooring to this. Go into that group, select that face, and let's use this fella. That looks really nice. Maybe we'll use this light one. There we go. Lovely stuff. All right. Let's unhide everything. We can go View, Hidden Geometry, Hidden Objects, Control A to select everything, right click, and unhide. All right, this is a good time to save as well if you haven't saved in a while. Now you can see the floor plan is actually cutting through here. That's absolutely okay. Sooner or later, we'll move the floor plan away and we won't need it much anymore. This looks really good. Let's go ahead and start grabbing windows and doors. All right, the next thing to do is to get windows and doors in. So I've gone ahead and downloaded two types of windows, and I used Pella, which is P-E-L-L-A, and I just set my warehouse to catalogs and set it to likes. And Pella should be one of the first that pops up. And then this is just a generic door that I also grabbed from the warehouse. Now, one thing to note, the Pella windows are actually components, which is sort of not my favorite way to work. And you'll notice if we try to do anything like scale these up, we can't. We're unable to scale them. So I'm going to select this and I'm going to explode it. And I'm going to keep exploding this until effectively there's nothing left. So I'm going to left click, keep dragging out a selection and keep exploding and exploding. And what this does is effectively breaks apart the entire component. Now I can right click, make it a group, and I should be able to scale without any problems. There we go. Looks pretty nice. Same with this one over here, and the same with the door. I prefer to have everything exploded and then regrouped. Okay, now let's go ahead and move the door first. Left click, drag, and you can see it actually comes in pretty nicely. The scale is about right, might be a little short, but all in all, looks pretty good. I could probably leave this right where it is, but you can see it doesn't line up perfectly with the walls. So I'm just click off that, double click to get into the wall group, and I'm going to use push pull to just push these walls to the left just a little bit. You want to make sure they snap so they look pretty tight. You don't want any strange sort of holes in the geometry or where things meet, because in D5 light will actually pass through them, which kind of ruins the illusion a little bit. Okay, at the top, yeah, I can see this door probably needs to come forward just a little bit, but we also need to draw lines across here. So I'm going to draw a line across here to here, and I'm going to use push-pull to just push that forward to where it snaps on the edge. Now, if this is done beautifully cleanly, you should be able to erase these lines, especially if things snap nicely. But don't worry if there's a lot of stray edges in your shot, because D5 won't render them. Okay, and now use push-pull to push the top down. Again, I'm trying to get it to snap nicely, or just where it fits snug and you're not getting light bleeding through. Okay, I can move this door forward a little bit now. Just drag that forward until it's about flush, and I think that looks pretty good. There's a slight issue with the floor. We may have to tweak this a little bit or bring it down a little bit, but I think that's pretty nice. And this will function just fine as a sort of generic door. I'm going to fix up that little gap right in here as well. And remember, when you're working with groups, you don't have to click on the group twice to get in there. Okay, lovely stuff. Let's do the same for the window. Okay, I've gone ahead and exploded this window too. And this is a triple window in the floor plan, so I'm going to go ahead and drag that right over there. And you may be wondering, how high should I make my windows? Well, in the US, the average is about 3 feet. So I'm going to left click and lift that up. And I don't know if that's going to be the same everywhere around the world, but it seems like a pretty stable height to put your windows, or at least a safe height to put your windows at. Yeah, that looks pretty nice. Now we got to do the same technique. In fact, that might be a little high for this window. So let's go ahead and I'm actually going to bring it down a tiny bit. There we go. All right. We're going to do the same technique. I'm going to go into the group here and I'm going to double click, use push pull to just push this fella back and make sure it kind of lines up with the inner part of the window. This outer frame can stay as an outer frame, but at least the inner part should match. Okay, looks good. Spin around, do the same on the other side. And again, trying to match it to the inner part of the window. That looks lovely. And then we're going to do the same on the bottom here. So just drawing lines on the surface using push-pull and making sure that it snaps. There we go. From the inside, I can go ahead and lift this up. And from the top, we'll do the exact same technique, just drawing across from here to here, use push-pull, and we should have no problem. Yeah, if that's done right, there we go, and snap, and do the same from underneath. And that's pretty much my technique for getting windows and doors in. This way they remain a separate entity, and you should hopefully be able to erase some of these stray edges without much problem. And the windows will be based on the floor plan, give or take just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and do the same with this window. For the other parts, this will be over here and here. And for our purposes, I'm going to ignore the back windows. I'll probably not finish these, but feel free to go ahead. This will very much going to depend on whether the client is paying for a single render up front, maybe one from the 3/4 side view from the shot like this, or if they want to see the entirety of the property. So that is obviously going to make your work a little bit harder and take a little bit more time. In other words, everything will have to be modeled. And as such, you'll have to put windows and decorate everything from the back as well. For our purposes, and just to speed things along for you as a learner, we're going to stick to just doing stuff from the front and 3/4 view. That'll speed things up. All right, I'm going to do the same process for the other windows, and I'll see you in a moment. Now, I've gone ahead and placed the windows and lined them up to what I think is an acceptable standard. And you'll also notice I've gone ahead and grabbed some shutters. These are decorative and not really very functional, but they are in sort of the sketches for this home. So I went ahead and added them from the warehouse. And this might be one of those things that, is really just best grabbed from the warehouse. You could make bespoke shutters, and they're certainly not the most complicated shapes, but in terms of time management and clever use of your workflow, what you can get from the warehouse and what you can get from the warehouse and more specifically use immediately is very, very useful. Okay, this is looking really, really nice. Let's move on and talk about how to build the roof. Now, this is obviously going to depend a little bit on your reference image. So now is a good time to go ahead and take a look at that and figure out the flow of your roof. Okay. So my roof predominantly goes from left to right, and there is an arch right here. So let's go ahead and build that really quickly. And I'll show you the technique that I use to build roofs. It may not be the most accurate, but it is kind of fast, and it's good enough to sort of do what you need it to do. In other words, not look too basic, but not so complicated that you have to get in and model every pier and beam. Okay. So what I'm going to do is grab the line tool. Bearing in mind, our building is still in a group, so that's totally fine. I'm going to just pick a point here, not quite on the edge, but just a little bit off. And I do that just to make it easier to find the midpoint. So click here, and I'm going to go ahead and find there's that midpoint, and it's pretty easy to find now on that line. And I'm going to left click and I'm going to bring up my ceiling. Well, this will be the exterior roof. And I'm going to bring it up to about 6 feet. And I'm going to connect these edges like that. And I think that's a reasonable height. I'm going to hit E on the keyboard, grab the eraser and just erase that central line. Going to go use my offset tool to just draw out a basic triangle shape. And then we're going to hit L on the keyboard and drop a point down from here to here and from here to here. Okay, now I'm going to spin the camera and I'm going to leave the inside hollow. And if we need to, we can always go back and change this. But I'm going to hit Control on the keyboard, switch to the alternative push-pull, which will keep the original edges and add new geometry on top, and left-click and drag that over to here. All right, that looks really, really nice. You can go ahead and close this out just by connecting this point to the opposite point there. Lovely. Very nice indeed. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is, this looks like what I said, not what you want, which is a very simplified depiction. this is, what beginner students often consider a roof to actually look like, but that's not quite right. And so we need to do a couple of things. I'm going to start from this side, and I'm going to hit Control, pull up the alternative push-pull, and let's actually drag this out first using the normal push-pull. Let's just make this perfectly even. There we go. And take it a little bit further. There, that looks good. A little bit of an overhang is nice. Hit Control, and I'm going to use alternative push-pull, and I'm going to lift up a roof. Now this secondary part is going to be a little bit thicker. That looks good. And I'm going to use then the standard push-pull to just drag this out and kind of over the eaves. That looks good. Yeah, I think that'll work. Let's do the same over here as well. What you're doing is breaking the silhouette so that from the side, it doesn't look completely flat. Now, is it going to be completely perfect? No, but it's unlikely to be the most examined thing in your render. All right, that looks pretty nice. Okay, it looks all in all pretty good. I'm going to do the same on the other side. Hit Control, the alternative push-pull, and we're going to bring up the back section to be sort of comparable. It doesn't have to be perfectly. You can see there's a little bit of a gap there. That's okay. Switch to the normal push-pull and just drag this out. And I'm going to take both of these out just as far as they need to. There we go. Now you can see we're getting that nice overhang. And if I turn on shadows and I go ahead and just spin this a little bit, now you can see where you're getting the look and impression of depth. So we're going to do this one more time. And this one is going to be a much smaller layer. And this is going to be what the tile will actually sit on, which is a much smaller layer. Give it a little bit more of an overhang on either side and do the same over here. Just a little bit more. And I think that looks pretty good because from this angle, you're getting that silhouette, that fall off shape. So it doesn't just look like a flat triangular drawing. Now, I'm also going to go ahead and make some adjustments here. Maybe pull the surface out just a little bit. Pull that one out just a little bit too. And we can also use the alternative push-pull to bring these surfaces down here and give them a little bit of thickness just so they look a lot more constructed. I think that looks pretty nice. I'll take that there. Yeah, that looks good. And you could get really in depth into this and figure out the exact mechanics of how to build a actual functional roof for your buildings. I just don't know that it's necessary, nor do I know is it a good use of your time. Now, while we're here, we can probably go ahead and delete our scale reference. We don't really need him anymore. And I'm going to do the same technique on the back, and I'm going to skip that for you learners so you don't have to watch that. But all in all, that looks pretty nice. So looking at my floor plan and reference, we also have a stoop right here, which is basically just the area in front of the door. And we can see with these lines here, that tells us there's 2 steps up. Now, we still have our foundation, that's fine. But I'm concerned with the overhang. Now, the overhang looks like it probably comes out at least to this point, but maybe a little bit further out. So I'm just going to draw on the surface here. I'm drawing on the group, not in the group. I'm just going to drag up 2 straight lines, and this will be just to help us kind of line up where the next part of the roof needs to go. And there we go. These lines are kind of useless, and we'll delete them later, but they're good to know. Now, I'm going to select our actual house build, and I'm going to hide it. I can select the windows, and I'm going to just select almost every loose element within the scene, and we'll hide that too. And then what I'm going to do is just left-click and drag a selection out over this new roof that we built. Deselect by holding Shift on anything I don't need. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to make it a group. So now we've got almost everything is grouped, and we can just unhide everything. There we go. Control S, now is a good time to do that. Now, I'm going to draw another similar setup. So hide this roof, and we're going to draw our new roof pretty much using the exact same technique. I'm going to find a point here that I think kind of lines up quite nicely with the lines that we drew. Again, good enough is often good enough. I think that looks good. Find that nice midpoint. And I think I just lost the midpoint. I think we can take this up. It won't be as tall, I don't think, as the rest that we just did. Okay, that looks good. to there to there, and there to there. Hit E on the keyboard, get rid of that. And we're going to use the same technique. Let's really quickly, I'm not going to run through it as slowly, but we'll use the same technique. Go ahead and use offset, then drop 2 lines down here, 2 lines down here. We're going to use the alternative push-pull. I'm going to drag this off the surface about, let's see how far we need to take this. And we can take it to about there. Looking at it from the side, that'll work. And we can push it back just a little bit because we know there'll be a bit more of an overhang than would normally be there. Okay, looks lovely. Using again, alternative push-pull, let's just lift this up. I'm going to lift up this side too to about the same height. And these ones need to be kind of a little bit thicker. And then the last one is going to be that kind of thin layer. And again, that's where your tile is actually going to sit. Okay, now looking at it from here, we can go ahead and just move this out. And we're going to drag these off the surface. Get a nice little bit of an overhang on this second level here. There we go. And lastly, take the tile layer out as well. Okay, that looks really nice. Now you'll notice we've got a little bit of a triangle gap here. Generally what I'll do with this is just connect this point to this point. That should be good enough. And I'll spin the camera, use there it is, that little triangle. And I'm just going to use the normal push-pull, hopefully this will work, and just drag that back just to cap it off. And that looks just fine. If you've got a little bit of an overhang here, you can always just go in and just connect, maybe do something along the lines of that, kind of crash them together, or you could go ahead and manually just connect this point to this point and effectively just ask Sketchup to cap this for you. Hit E again and do something similar. You just use the push-pull tool to drag that back. It doesn't really matter because really nobody's going to be looking at it that closely. Okay, that will work for our basic overhang. And I'm going to use the alternative push-pull to just drag out 2 more sections here. All right, they will work effectively where the posts are going to go. But for our purposes, if we go ahead now and I'm going to select all of this, right-click, make it a group, and then unhide the other parts, you can see, yeah, looks pretty nice. Not too bad at all. So at this point, we're getting close to sending our model over to D5. And it's worth just pointing out a few more things that you'll need to do before we go over there. I went ahead and added a second area on the roof, just pretty much using the same technique. And I've crashed that directly into the main roof. Now you can see it nicely lines up a little bit with the area that overhangs the stoop. So that looks pretty good from back here. Now, we do need to go ahead and make a few more changes. Now is a good time to go ahead and hide the floor plan. We don't really need that anymore. It's also a good time to do maybe a Control-A, hit M on the keyboard, and lift just everything up a little bit. You want to avoid being sort of below this red axis. I've also gone ahead and changed my style from one of the default modeling styles to one of the styles that's a little lighter in terms of SketchUp performance. Now, if you like the style you're working with and you just want to keep that, but maybe you've noticed SketchUp is getting a little bit slower, you can always go to Edit and turn off Profiles, and this will have an almost immediate impact on performance. Now, if you're not going to be showing the back of your build or design, and even though there are technically windows there, I think it's pretty safe to go ahead and close these out. You don't really need them. They're not going to serve any real function. It really just comes down to, are they going to be visible? Yes or no. And if not, then there's no real need to put windows there. Nobody's really going to be looking at them unless, for example, you want to take your client on a actual like 3D walkthrough of the house. But for the most part, if they're not going to be seen, my mentality is that it saves a bit of time and will save them a little bit of money by effectively not showing them the back. And really, it's probably not the most interesting part of your design anyway. Now, other things we'll have to do is change the interior wall colors. So I'm going to go ahead and go into this group, and we're going to hide this, and I'm going to hide this wall as well. And we're going to make sure that really all of the interior surfaces are their own thing. Now, I'm going to color code these using sort of just random colors. It doesn't really matter what color you use. It's just something so that D5 knows that it is its own separate surface. If you wanted to get really particular, you could go in here and really kind of colorize your build sort of based on how you think it might look when it's actually finished or interior decorated or painted. But for our purposes, since we're concerned with an exterior commercial render for this project, I'm going to go ahead and just fill these with really just a generic color. And I think that'll work pretty nicely. So I'm just going to keep working my way around. I'm going to do the same for the floor, which is its own thing here. And basically the ceiling. Now you'll notice, interestingly enough, the ceiling is formed from our roof model. This again should not be a problem, since what we'll be doing is rendering from sort of, an angle like this, or maybe a little bit like this. And so we won't really be looking in and up. If you needed to, you could make a separate ceiling, or you could detach and clean up maybe this surface area here. But for our purposes, we'll leave it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and color code it, and in the next video, we're going to add a ground plane, and we're going to add fencing, because really, for exterior renders, the primary thing will be hiding that horizon line. All right, I'll see you in the next video when we go ahead and find a fence. All right, I have gone ahead and color coded everything, so this should work. One thing to note about doing the roof area is oftentimes I see my students, they'll go ahead and take a tile material and they'll pretty much run it over the entire roof, but this is not really accurate. So if you can limit the tile material to really just the top section, completely just the top of this surface, the end result is substantially better looking. I fixed up the interior a little bit and make sure all the walls are consistent. And personally, I actually found it a little bit faster to just slightly differentiate and put on a different color on the exterior. That was a little faster than working through all the interior colors. And I did go ahead and add the stoop area with two very simple steps, with each one has a slight lip just to show that they've been constructed. Now, I've also got a fence from the warehouse. And because we're going for more commercial rendering, this isn't like the fanciest looking fence, but it will work for our purpose. One thing to be mindful of, this fence here, it's basically got a tiling wood material on it. You can see it effectively looks the same. I am going to go ahead and apply a different wood material on the inside to this. So I'm going to pick, let's do this wood veneer, and I'm going to go in here and put this on pretty much all of this interior section. Now, the reason I'm doing that is I want to have more control over the wood material when I come to put it on in D5. I want to be able to run the wood material perhaps from left to right, or have it be scaled differently to the wood material that you'd get on this section right here. So just something to be mindful of. And if you do it now, it might help in the future. Okay, let's move this out of the way. And I've got our little scale measurement. I think it's a good time to go ahead and just delete that. Control S, do a quick save. And we're going to build our ground plane. Now, the ground plane that you build is very much going to be dependent on the site, the geographic location of your actual build. But in saying that, we're going to work off the basis that this is just a vague lot sort of size. And, one where we're just going to go ahead and create what we think would be a suitable site for this house. Okay, there are two ways you can go about doing this. The first is pretty basic. Just grab the rectangle tool and go ahead and just drag out what you think a suitable area would be for this house for the garden. Now, there are a couple of benefits to doing it this way. You can actually look down on your site plan like this. You can also think about where you want the house to reside. And you've also got more control over where you put things like the driveway or if there's a walkway. Now, the second way we can do this is to go to the sandbox tools in Sketchup. And if you don't have these available to you, you may have to go to the extensions. It'll be under the extension warehouse and just look for sandbox. I do think they are installed in SketchUp by default, but if not, go ahead and do that. We're going to go up to Draw, Sandbox, and we're going to go from Scratch. Now, On the bottom right, you'll see grid spacing. I'm going to hit tab and type in 5 apostrophe. And what this means is when I left click and drag out my grid and click once, and then I'm going to move it to the right, you'll actually see the grid is going to be determined by that grid spacing. So I'm going to go ahead and hit tab 5 apostrophe and enter. All right. And now what we have is a grid. Now you may be thinking this doesn't look particularly much better than what we have over here, and that's somewhat true. The main difference though is with the grid on, we can double click, go into this group, and we can go up to tools and sandbox. So up here, not draw, oddly enough. So the initial step is to go to draw and then sandbox, and you can draw from scratch. But to actually do anything to this environment, we're going to go tools and sandbox and smooth. And smooth is going to be a mixture of the move and smooth brushes. It's a very large radius brush, but again, if you hit tab on your keyboard, you can type in a radius. So I'm going to do 10 apostrophe, so 10 feet, and hit enter, and there we go. And what this would allow you to do is go in here and basically lift up and down parts of the environment. So you can see here now, you could go in and really adjust the environment quite a bit. You could have it where the garden is got sort of a little bit of a more of a rolling dynamic. I think this does look good when you do this, but for our purposes, we're going to keep it a little bit simple, but I do want you just to be aware that you can always go in there and do that. In addition, what we might do is do a sandbox, but crash it into our ground plane. All right, let's go ahead and build a ground plane. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select our house temporarily and make sure everything is grouped. I think it is. So let's go ahead and look down, grab our rectangle tool, and we're going to build what we think would be a pretty reasonable site. So I'm going to maybe drag this forward a little bit there. Select this and just select all of it and move it back. I want to make sure we have a little bit of a back garden area. And we want to make sure that the driveway is sort of feasible. Could you go ahead and park a vehicle here? And I think that looks pretty good. We can always come back in and change this, but I think by and large, that looks pretty nice so far. All right. I'm going to go ahead and grab the rectangle tool. Well, actually, let's grab the line tool. And I'm just going to drop a quick point down from here to here. Now, this point doesn't serve any function. It'll just tell me exactly where this corner starts. And so I'm going to just drag out a little bit here. And I'm going to work my way around on the ground plane. Now, effectively, what this is going to be is a nice transition between our home and really just the rest of the garden. Let's go ahead and bring that all the way back to about here. Yeah, let's do that. And I think I've lost my line, so hit L on the keyboard again, just drag that back. And about here, and keep bringing this back over. Now, I should be able to erase these lines in there nicely. And you may be kind of wondering what the point of this is. Well, if your house just sits on a green field, it looks kind of strange. So from effectively a sort of garden planning or garden design point of view, it's nice to have a transition from this section grass to maybe some trim that runs around the house to the actual house itself. So if we were, for example, to really just select everything, hold down Shift and select our ground plane, and let me do that again, Control A, and right click and hide. There we go. That's sort of what we have going on. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now, in the next section, let's go ahead and draw our driveway and draw any other areas that we think might be necessary for the gardening component. And let's go ahead and start wrapping our fence around our house. In this video, we're going to go ahead and move our fence into place. So I've moved it to the left. It's sitting a little in from the actual edge. If you just have it straight on the edge right here, it kind of makes a strange transition, looks very abrupt. So let's go ahead then and left click once, drag out a duplicate, and I'm going to go ahead and place that there. Hit tab on the keyboard, and then hit multiply, and I'm going to type in 4. There we go. It's gone a little over. Delete the stray one. And holding Shift, go ahead and select these. Right click, make it a group. And again, tap Control, drag out a duplicate, crash it to the right. And again, let's just drag that over there. Looks lovely. And we're going to do this one more time. Grab a duplicate and hit Q and just spin this little guy about 90 degrees. And that should line up nicely. So this will be the back of our home. So basically the back fence here. And I'm going to drag it just forward just a little bit. Doesn't really matter if it doesn't line up perfectly. Let's see, can we move this a little bit here? There. I'm going to grab our fence line at the back, just drag the floor plane itself, and that's grouped. So I'm going to go into that group and just drag this guy back a little bit more, and then select this group and drag here. All right, good enough is good enough, I think. Now, we've got a little bit of a stray one over here, but again, this shouldn't really matter too much. Hopefully, nobody's going to be looking really at these back corners. Now, I've also gone ahead and created, using the sandbox tools, effectively an undulating landscape here. And we may or may not end up using this. Sometimes it's nice to have really grass that, you know, has a little bit of a flow to it, but we'll do a check on that a little bit later. For now, we can go ahead and hide it. We don't need it. Now, everything else is looking, I think, pretty good. Now is probably a good time to maybe go ahead and delete our reference image. I don't think we're going to need that anymore at all. I think we're pretty comfortable with it. We can delete it. All is good there. And I think it's time to really bring everything together. We'll move the house directly down, or we'll move the floor up to meet it. But that, for the most part, is really our SketchUp work done. I'm going to extend the fence a little bit, and I'm going to draw a simple driveway just for where a vehicle would be parked. And I might add maybe a little stepping area to the door. But by and large, I think we're pretty much done in SketchUp. In the next section, we're going to bounce directly into D5. And I'm going to work off the assumption that you've probably watched the previous video in this series, our interior rendering component. And so we're going to move a little bit faster, because I think really what a lot of you want to get to is, you know, how to set up your camera and how to make this render look as good as possible. Okay, I'm going to pause here. In the next video, we'll be in D5. All right, everybody, here we are in D5. Made a little change to the ground plane, maybe just dragged it out a little bit from the front, so we had a little bit more breathing room there, and sort of took a little space from the back. Also cleaned up the fences back here just a little bit, but other than that, everything is just as we left it in SketchUp. Okay, first thing I'm going to do here now is to set up our cameras. Again, this is effectively sort of commercial property rendering. You know, we're going to avoid some of the really dramatic camera angles that you often get in architectural rendering. We're not really into making it super stylized. We just want it to look as realistic as we possibly can. I'm going to go up here and create a new scene. This will be effectively our beauty shot, really our primary shot. Now, please note the camera angle and focal length is adjustable. We're just setting up where we want our cameras to be. Now, unless you're going to place one here, and if we are getting, you know, seeing through the fence here, we can always get rid of that or hide it when the time comes. We're just setting up cameras. One thing you might want to be aware of is this button here. I'm going to toggle camera switch only. So just make sure that that is on. In other words, what we're doing here is if we, for example, change the weather or we have variances between these scenes, I don't want those to be manifest in the actual camera changes. All I want is for scene 1 to be this camera, scene 2 to be this, and scene 3 this. But I don't want the individual scenes to be radically different. And so that's something just to be mindful of. This little button, camera switch only. All right, now this is looking pretty nice. We're going to go ahead and start really picking materials. And again, When it comes to the material choices, we're going for realism. They may not be the fanciest or the shiniest, but hopefully they'll be the most representative of what your actual model is going to look like when it's actually constructed. Welcome back, everybody. In this video, we're going to go ahead and start applying our materials. Now, I'm not going to run through every material that I'll use in this scene, but I will talk about the primary ones that I want to use. You will definitely need three main materials for this. The first is going to be the outside material. Now, you can use cladding or wood paneling. Now, I haven't tried that in D5 myself, so what we're going to do is firstly go to our materials tab, so hit M on the keyboard and make sure this is set to materials. We're going to go down to wall and roof and wall paint. Now, wall paint in these 83 materials, by the way, this is D5 2.3. I think right now, at the time of recording, I'm about a week out from the release of 2.4. So this may look a little bit different going forward. I believe there's a plan to sort of clean up some of the materials and asset browsers. But for our purposes right now, wall paint, 83 tabs, and we've got quite a lot here. I've gone ahead and favorited some of the ones that I like the most, including the white rough wall, the white paint, generic, just perfect white paint, and white concrete and yellow and white concave material. For our purposes, let's try using the white rough wall first. And if that doesn't work, we can always switch to the white wall paint. So I'm going to go ahead and place that here. And it'll be a little hard to tell exactly how this looks, but if you zoom in, you can see we're seeing some of that relief and normal map details. Now, I do think this is probably more realistic than a perfectly white wall. But if you find it looks a little too rough, feel free to change that out. The second material may be a little bit trickier. I'm thinking of doing a black and white color scheme, but obviously the color scheme that you choose will very much depend on what you've been told or what your client has suggested. So keep that in mind. But I'm going to do a black and white color scheme for this. So the next thing we'll need is a wood material that we can convert to basically a wood material that has been painted black, or maybe some sort of black laminate exterior. I'm going to go down to wood, and there's oftentimes I've noticed my students have a tendency of looking for one that sort of fits what they think it should look like. So they tend to grab ones that have a lot of striping. So they may go to the floor tab and they may go, okay, here's wood, or, here's wood flooring because, it's wood. But the problem with these materials is they do tend to have that striping. And so when you place that on a surface, you're forced to deal with really the pattern that presents itself. And yes, you could turn on triplanar and you can tweak the settings, but what you actually really need is just a wood grain material. These do not necessarily have the same level of tiling that you see in other materials, but I think overall they'll look a little bit better. I'm going to place this cedar wood material. I can try the triplanar, but yeah, we'll leave it as is. And let's just see what happens now if we were to go ahead and select this and adjust the base color and go ahead and just make that dark. See, I think that looks a little bit better. You do get some textural variation. I'm going to avoid complete black because nothing in real life is, completely black. So I'm just going to move it up a little bit. There we go. And I think overall that may look a lot better going forward. Your mileage on this obviously may vary a little bit, but I think that will work quite nicely. I'm going to go ahead and use my eyedropper to sample from it. And I'm going to hit O on the keyboard. And I'm going to apply that now to the trim running around as well. We want to make sure that in terms of scaling, it looks okay. So feel free to go in here and adjust the stretch a little bit. And again, your subjective experience might be a little different to mine. I think that looks okay. And I'm kind of liking the effect that that has. I'm going to turn triplanar on. I think that looks pretty nice. Let's go back and look at our stored cameras. I think it's already looking a little bit better. We don't have light falling on it yet, so I'm going to change the geo and sky and just spin that. This would be the equivalent of spinning the real skies in, that would be Lumion, or using one of the sort of HDRI skies in Twinmotion. I think that looks pretty good. All right, let's move on. The third main material that we are going to need is Well, roofing is one, but also the plastic, effectively the laminate here that you'd have on the window frames. So let's look at that next. Now, for the windows, I've gone ahead and gone to the plastic tab, and I'm actually just going to use this ordinary light plastic, and I'm going to drag that out onto the window frames. Now, we have a slight issue with the way these windows were constructed, and I'm going to show you this a little bit. If I move very slowly into the window here, you can see the actual framing on the inside is really deeply embedded into that group. It probably won't be the biggest issue, but there is a possibility that we'll have to go in and try and get our hands on these parts right here and see if we can't adjust them separate to the glass. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and select our door. And again, I might try for a, yeah, I think that looks pretty nice on the door itself. Okay, things are taking shape. It's looking good. I'm going to apply next a concrete material on this trim here, and I'm going to try some various wood materials for the stoop or the step area. And I think black, white, and maybe some sort of maybe coffee or darker wood materials will go really well with this. All in all, pretty happy. I'm going to continue applying the materials. I'm going to jump forward a little bit so that you, the viewer, don't have to watch me pick and choose materials. But it'll be good for you, I think, in some ways, to just try different things and see what works. I know I've got my favorited materials, and I tend to fall back on these quite a lot. And hopefully, the more you use D5, the more you too will actually start favoring particular materials, and you can always just toggle them on and off with the little heart icon. Okay, in the next video, I'll have fully materialized our build, and we can start talking about the decorative elements, or what I like to think of as the set dressing, the greenery and the foliage within our scene. All right, I'll see you in the next section. Now that we've gone ahead and added some more materials to our scene, you can see that we've added wood materials, and we've gone ahead and put some metal on the doors, and really the exterior of our build is essentially done. Now, you may also be looking at this and thinking it looks a little bit basic, and to some degree it is. Commercial rendering is not necessarily about showing off the most complicated model or the most complicated design or build that you'll ever work on, but ultimately you are being tasked with the creation and rendering of realistic real-world projects. And it may not be always the most glamorous project. Sometimes it can be relatively simple, like a one-story family home like this one. And so effectively, you want to do the best job you can do with that. Now, the next thing we need to work on is what I like to think of as the set dressing, or setting the scene. And the first thing we're going to do is start adding foliage around the tree. Now, in a more likely scenario, you'll probably have homes on either side of this home, but for our purposes, we just want to show that there is something there outside of just this fence line. So you're going to hit M on the keyboard. And what we're going to do is start adding a number of these generic broadleaf trees behind our actual home. So I'm going to start with this broadleaf 60. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the left here and I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to double click on where it says layer 1 and I'm going to title this trees. We can also add some extra layers as well. We can also add one here for decoration. So DECO for deco or decoration. And I'm going to go ahead and start placing these. Now, when it comes to placing the trees in D5, you'll notice that without the absence of a ground plane, sometimes the trees have a tendency to kind of float a little bit. So you can find a nice little corner that you could place your tree on, or get in the habit of selecting your trees after you place them and go ahead and manually position them. So we're going to go for effectively 3 layers, if you will, but maybe a good way to think of it would be 3 distances. So we will have some decoration, some trees close to the camera that will frame our build. We also want to have some trees that are going to be in the medium distance, perhaps over here to the right or a little bit over here on the left. And then finally, we'll arrange some trees in the far distance. And again, a lot of times, this just goes back to trying to hide your horizon line. And so I'm going to go ahead and place a series of trees. Now, what I have done, and what I strongly recommend that you actually take the time to do, is to work your way through the broadleaf section of the D5 asset library and look for the trees that you think will be useful. You want to look for trees that have a nice variety of shape and height, but are in many ways more generic and not tied to a specific geographic region. In other words, find very simplistic, basic trees that will work with pretty much any rendering that you're doing. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and arrange some of these trees in what looks, at least to me, to be a sort of visually appealing manner. And when you come to your own projects, one of the big things I will point out, and one of the mistakes my students often make, is either not adding enough trees, so basically putting one or two and then thinking that looks good, or having trees that really clown out. Effectively, they crowd the environment here. In other words, they overly populate the trees and put too many. So there is a fine line here, and some of that will just come with experience and time. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and place my background trees, my set dressing, and I'll see you in the next video. Okay, so here we have gone ahead and placed our foliage on the outside of our fence, and you can see it already looks a little bit more natural. Now, one issue we were having with, though, was that even with all of the trees in place, the scene was still looking a little bit empty. If I move my camera here, you can kind of see we've got quite a lot of foliage, but overall, we're still running into a little bit of an issue when it comes to the placement of the environment. These trees look really nice, but they feel a little bit slightly out of place and slightly without context. And even though they're going to be in the background, it's so nice to have your scene feel a little bit more cohesive. One way we can do that is to go back to Sketchup. We're going to click on the warehouse and we're going to search for this background. And so when you do that, you'll actually get quite a lot of different models. And we're looking for something akin to this. These are by Max Ekovsky, and they're just these beautiful flat planes, or sometimes curved planes, that have PNG images on them. Now, the PNG images have transparency. So when you bring them into a render, you will see the tree line, effectively the images, but you won't see a strange skyline area. Now, I've gone ahead and downloaded this one here, background tree, but you can see there's a whole bunch of different options. You just got to pick one that works with your scene. Now, back in SketchUp, let me go ahead and just click on hide all my content. And I'm going to just right click on this and go unhide. And there we can go. We can see that we have our actual sort of environment brought in. One thing you will want to be mindful of is making sure that the horizon lines still actually work fine. You don't want to bring in an environment like this and find that it's actually sitting really high in the sky, because that's really going to throw off the entire image. So you've got to sort of imagine where a realistic horizon line would actually be. And so when we do that, I'm going to go ahead and hit update, go back to D5. Now we can see when we look, if we were even to just move the camera up and over our fence line, we can see we get a really nice sort of pseudo or fake horizon. You'll also see, and this is really important, we're getting reflections in the glass now. So if I was to spin my camera, this is effectively what we're seeing reflected in the glass instead of just the infinite flat horizon line. We're getting something a little bit nicer and a little bit more nuanced. Okay, with that being said, it's time to move on, get grass in our scene, and to start decorating our building a little bit more. But overall, I think the environment is pretty nice. There's definitely going to be some changes, and you will find this no matter how well you place your trees or your greenery or the vegetation, you're always probably going to come back maybe the next day or maybe a few hours later and notice some issues, and that's just a part of it. It's very difficult to do this perfectly from scratch. So we may make some changes here and there, but overall, the general look and feel is pretty good. All right, I'll see you in the next video. I'm going to talk about planting some plants and adding grass to our scene. In this video, we're going to go ahead and add grass to our scene, and after that we can add some plants and foliage within our scene to increase the realism. Firstly, I'm going to hit I on my keyboard. I'm going to sample this material here, the green material. You can see it's just a very generic green material that came from SketchUp. I'm going to go to the top right here and change my material template to grass. All right, that's going to take a little bit of time, but there it is. Okay, you can see here now, if we zoom in, we've got these really, really nice sprigs of sort of procedurally generated D5 grass materials. We can also go ahead and change them. And so if we're looking for a particular look and feel, we have at least 3 base options here. And now I believe that if you bring in a different grass or a different texture map, you can also assign a grass material to that. Now, however, we're going to leave with just something simple here. Let's go to maybe this middle one, and we'll see if this works for our purposes. We can adjust the height here, and you can see by cranking that to the right, we can bring up the overall height of the individual strands. And we can also adjust the density as well. So if we wanted a very Spartan feel to our look, we could. But overall, these are pretty nice. We also have the ability to trim our grass so we can make it a little bit more uniform and look a bit more manicured, as if the grass is in fact a lot more cut. But overall, because we're going for effectively a commercial property render, it's nice to have grass that looks, for the most part, a bit more maintained. However, in saying that, I still like this grass here. So we're going to try different grasses. I'm going to start with this one here. And I'm going to go ahead and maybe just adjust the trim value just a little bit till we get something a little bit more organic. Now, I think that looks pretty nice. Let me increase the density just a little bit. All right, overall, I think that looks pretty good. Now, since we're doing exterior renders, it is worth taking the time to note that sometimes you may run into an issue with Sketchup. And that may be that D5 may try and put the grass here. And this is really to do with the way SketchUp interprets normals, or in other words, which way the face is actually looking. So for example, if I go into this group here and I right click and I go reverse faces and I click out of that and I send this over to D5, you may find this is what happens. So your grass is there, it's just not displaying correctly. So all you have to do is bounce back to SketchUp, select the face where the grass is, and reverse it again. And that should send everything over nicely. As we start approaching the end, we should go ahead and start decorating some of the greener areas. And I'm going to start planting around here first, and then we're going to try and fill in the corners. And lastly, we'll plant some trees in a sort of aesthetically or visually pleasing place that will act as a frame for our home. And again, we're going for something as closely resembling reality as we can. So we're actually going to avoid a lot of the more over-the-top or ostentatious arrangements of flowering plants. And so what I'm going to do is here, I'm going to go hit M on my keyboard, and I've gone looking in 2 specific groups. The first is shrubs. And here you're going to find a wide array of really sort of large, bulky, but low-rise greenery. So for example, the Thymus mongolius, which is basically thyme, but it's just a large thyme plant. That'll look really, really nice. And also a few others that you may find useful. Now, some of these will have varying use depending on what it is you're actually working on. For example, the gardenia is another great one, or the golden privet are really good plants that you can place in your scene. They'll look really good, and they'll use up quite a lot of space. 2 other areas that we can look at are flowering shrubs, and you can see we've, again, a wide variety here, and also the flowering herbs as well. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and just grab a few plants that I've already bookmarked. So I'm going to go up to favorites, and you can see I've got quite a large favorites menu here. And I'm going to ignore the trees for a moment. And what I'm looking for is plants that will form within a very simple color arrangement. So we're going to start with the Astrantia major here, and I'm going to go ahead and place that. All right. Now, I'm not too worried about the overlap here. I just want to make sure that these plants are not cutting into the actual walls. Now, I've placed one white one. I'm going to place another one here as well. Maybe we'll go for something a little bit thinner. All right. Gardenia. And I think I'm going to place maybe 2 of those here. Select the second one and duplicate it. And in this technique, what we're actually going to do is really just build up a small little area, and then we can go ahead and duplicate from that. You can also see I've got a bunch of other assets that I've bookmarked that have been very, very useful in other projects too. And now is a good time. Let's grab this gardenia, and I'm actually going to place this right here. And so you can see what I'm doing is building up a scene in a way that would be relatively feasible. I'm not going and adding in a ton of random content. I'm not throwing in a huge amount of random plants. I'm just going to place stuff in the way that I think it would most likely be planted. And we can always scale these down. There we go. Just holding down the C key on the keyboard there, and we can scale that up. And again, I'm not hugely worried about going over, but I am worried about crashing into the actual building. So I'm going to select anything that I think is a little bit too close here. And I'm just going to go ahead and hit V on the keyboard, spin the camera, just make sure that these are not crashing through. Now, all in all, what we have is a pretty nice selection there. So we've got a couple of options here. I'm going to hold down Control, and I can manually select these. And effectively, I'm forming these into a temporary group. I can also just go to my Objects tab on the bottom left here, and I can just look for really the ones that meet the criteria. So we've got all the Astrantia, Gardenias, all of them have effectively been named here. And now that I've done that, what I can do is pull my camera back, do a Control D, and I've duplicated these plants. Now, I think I'm missing one, but that doesn't matter. We can also just hold down Shift and drag out a duplicate, which will be familiar to anyone who's come from kind of a SketchUp background. All right, that looks pretty nice. I've got a few empty spaces that I need to fill. And when it comes to that, I'm going to again look for something that I think will work well within the actual scene. So I'll place these here. And I may add in something else, this Consolidia. And I'm going to just scale this up a little bit. Again, I'm planting things that I think would sort of look feasible within the space that I have. And I'm using a very, very limited color palette, keeping it very simple, very basic. Go. Going to drop in our thyme. Also trying to avoid any areas of maybe excessive or obvious repetition. So these guys here, I may just delete them and drag this gardenia over a little bit. So it's looking not too bad. All in all, everything looks a little bit feasible. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same on this side here as well. I'm going to run one or two shrubs maybe down along here with slightly larger scale. This technique should work pretty well for most things that you're working on. It keeps your gardening element, which is usually for a lot of us not our primary focus when you're doing architectural rendering. But nevertheless, just being aware of what looks good and what works together will help you quite a bit. And again, keeping it simple, a little bit of repetition, and maybe a very simple color scheme will go a very long way when it comes to making your designs look cohesive. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause there. I'll pick it up after I've added a few more greeneries to the front. We've added a little bit of shrubbery on the side. Now that we've gone ahead and planted some more greenery, and we've gone ahead and planted some of these golden privet along the edge. So I've gone for 5. I think that'll do a good job of just sort of cleaning up that edge so we're not getting some of those really harsh lines. Now, we're going to add a little bit of decoration here on the back and sides. And so, for example, you can see right here, you get a really sharp corner. And I think even though we're not purely concerned with the planting of vegetation and getting into garden design, that's not necessarily our primary focus. Just visually looking at, from a restored viewpoints, you get a very harsh edge right here where the fence meets. And so let's go in there and soften this up a little bit. Now I've moved this off of the tree layer, and you can see when I toggle the tree layer, that gets rid of everything. So I'm just going to put this on the decoration layer. I'm going to ignore everything else right now. And we're just going to add in some kind of a little bit more of an interesting look here. So let's go ahead and go to the flower and shrubs. And I'm just going to see we've got some colorful gardenias. So I'm going to go and place these. I'm going to scale them a little bit. I don't want them to be enormous, but just take them up a little bit. There we go. And we're going to just make this corner kind of a little bit messier, but a little bit more organic, as if you've got objects that were, they were kind of placed in here, or maybe they grew from seeds, but very randomly assigned. And so I think, yeah, we'll add some shrubbery, and then I think what we'll end up doing is adding in just a little bit. So maybe some jasmine here will look good. And you'll notice I'm still keeping relatively the same color scheme. So I'm going to go ahead and just add some jasmine. I'm going to sprinkle this around the scene just a little bit. And then lastly, I'm going to look for something that's maybe a little larger, something that will do a good job kind of killing this spot a little bit, so we don't have to worry too much about it. Yeah, I think that will look really, really cool. And I'm going to go and let's put this here. And we'll take a quick look at scene 2. I think I'll need to move these plants just a little bit. And I think I need to add a few little more sprigs of maybe just something in here, just to kind of offset. This is looking a little bit too mechanical, maybe looking for my liking, but it'll do a nice job of just breaking up this scene here. There, I think that looks good. It's a little bit tidier now, and I'll patch those down. Just something very small, but it's enough now to, I think, really help hide that corner. Now, the other thing we're going to do is look for some full-on decorative trees for our own garden. Now, I'm going to go back to my favorites. And again, this is why it really benefits you to work your way through the model library. And even though you've got, 500 broadleaf, 142 flowering trees, a lot to work your way through, it is definitely worth taking the time. And that way you can find things that you really like the look of, and you can test out trees that you think will work really, really well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for some, what we can consider to be hero trees. Now, I've already gone ahead and bookmarked some of these, but these are a little too fall or autumn-like for our purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and see, can we find something in either the maple family or the crepe myrtle family. All right, let's do that next. So you can see we've gone ahead and added a few more decorative trees. Now, I wasn't able to find anything in the crepe myrtle family of trees that I liked, so we've gone ahead and placed a number of Acer trees. Acer trees here you can see on the bottom left, which are actually better thought of as maple trees, including the Japanese maple. And so we've placed 2 smaller ones here and another one here. And these are effectively to denote trees that are still sort of growing and that haven't been established very long, which is consistent with what you get in a new home build. There's a very good chance that, for example, these trees wouldn't even be here. They'd be planted pretty soon after. However, you may still find that there are older trees on the site, and these ones would be ones that have been preserved or were intentionally kept by the builder or developer. So you can probably get away with adding, a few older ones. These will also give us a very lovely dappled shadow effect when the time comes to render. All right, let's go ahead and turn back on our true layer. All right, so make sure my display is set to high. You can see we've got a pretty good setup right now. And this is, of course, before we've done anything to do with the overall render settings. Now, it's time to add a few last finishing touches. We're going to adjust the plants that we've placed here just a little bit. There's 1 or 2 gaps that I think are a little bit pronounced, and some areas that need a little bit of sort of attention. Also going to tweak the grass ever so slightly, just so we get something more akin to what we want. And I'm getting some interesting patches going on here, so that's something that we'll need to adjust. And lastly, we're getting a few areas where you can see there is a cutoff between the asphalt material, the road material, and the actual, really the beginning of the grass. And I think we need to go in and tweak those. Okay, I'm going to go make some changes, and I'll see you in the next video where we're going to go ahead and start setting up our render settings. So as we head towards the end, there are a couple of features that I'd like to add, mostly decorative in nature. Also, you may have noticed some limitations with the D5 grass material right here. There are some weird patches and areas that really can't really be fixed in the current D5 version 2.3 and possibly going forward. Oftentimes, you can go in and paint grass materials in. I think we'll just fix these with Photoshop. But if you're using a future version of D5, hopefully this has been fixed. But we'll fix it in post-production. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and go to the models, and we're going out of the nature tab, and we're going to actually go to, let's go to lamps. And we're going to look for something that we can place on either side of the door as a decorative lamp. And I think these, let's see, let's have a quick look through what we can do here. Now, we want something that obviously complements our actual scene as well. There's no point in adding lights that really sort of break the illusion or don't fit stylishly with what we've got so far. So I'm going to grab these industrial style matte lights, and I'm going to actually just place one. I find it easier sometimes to place and then do a quick Control D just to basically duplicate and place. And now I'm going to go ahead and select this, hit V, spin this, and I'm going to get this as nice and flush as I can up against the wall. Okay. And I'm going to raise this and maybe centralize it just a little bit. And I think that looks good. And drag out a duplicate for this as well. And I think the scale is overall pretty good. Let's do another Control D, and I'm going to place this one. And I should maybe bring this forward just a little bit. I think it's sort of a little embedded into the wall. And these should line up nicely. Also going to look for some other decorative elements that we could potentially use. Let's grab the floor lamps and just see if there's anything that we could potentially use there. Now, we are doing an exterior render here, so it could be a good idea. Let's search for lantern. All right, so there's nothing coming up, so we can always grab something from the warehouse if needs be as well. Okay, exterior lighting is looking pretty good. I'm going to grab some pots. So this is going to be under accessories. And we're going to go to potted greenery. I'm going to get rid of the search bar lantern. So potted greenery. Okay, this looks pretty nice. Now we're not going to overly decorate, if you will, the exterior. We just want to have something that says that, you know, there's habitation and that there's been really some effort just put in to maybe have some plants just to the left of the door. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll scale this down. Probably as good as we can get that. Take down a little bit more. There we go. Looks pretty nice. And I'm going to grab another potted plant and place it right beside it. These don't really serve any function, really. They are just to sort of show that there's a little bit of habitation and that there are people here who maybe have gone ahead and just planted some stuff, or just put one or two plants on either side of the door, purely decorative, purely just for aesthetic purposes. That's all, just for the look. Okay, go back to our restored camera, and I think these are looking pretty good, especially with the lights. Now, I'd still love to get maybe a lantern model that we could place in there, but for now, I think this is looking okay. All right, in the next video, I think it's time to dive into the render settings. I'm going to go ahead and set up pretty much everything, and then I'll walk you right through it. All right, this looks pretty good. Let's move on. All right, everybody. One last thing I want to do here. Well, two things we should point out. Firstly, back in D5, I did go ahead and add a little bit of interior decoration. Not much, just a little dash, so that if your viewer does actually see into the home, it does look like there's a little bit of habitation going on in there. Now, the second thing that struck me was how empty this section seems. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a little decorative element. And to do that, we're going to go back to Sketchup. And I'm just going to draw a very simple pattern, very simple design on this. And I think that looks good. And this is a really basic way to go ahead and do that. There we go, using those nice little offset tool there. And I'm going to find the midpoint here if I can. Yeah, that looks good. And I'm going to do the comparable midpoint over here, even though technically this section is going to be hidden anyway. All right, that looks good. I think I can go ahead and erase this line here, and these ones here. And again, we're just going to rely on a little bit of our offset. And I'm going to get that about as comparable as I can. Yeah, I think that looks good. Okay, and then what I'll do is just connect these points. So the part I'm actually really interested in is the central pillar, and then these wings here that are coming off. So I'm just going to go ahead and connect these. Now you can hopefully see we've got really the basis of a design starting to form. Now it's pretty simple, but I think it'll look good for what we're doing. And more specifically, it kind of stylistically matches what we've already got. Okay, make sure my lines come all the way down. And sometimes it can be a little hard to visualize this. Sometimes it may help to go in and just maybe add a random color. So I'm going to use, let's just use this sort of dark cladding. And I'm going to apply my material there. All right, that looks pretty nice. And I'm going to do it on the sides here as well. Yeah, I think that looks pretty sweet. Okay, do the same effect over here. And I do want to make sure that these match up nicely. So neither side should be kind of bigger than the other. Okay, looks good. And I think I need to go ahead and connect this to here. And this to here. It's a little bit off, just slightly off, but I don't think that'll matter too much. Okay, I'm just cleaning up the design. All right. Let's do a little bit of push-pull. I'm going to use the alternative push-pull. So just hit Control with your on your keyboard. And I'm going to drag these out. Again, the alternative push-pull will hopefully leave the original geometry in place. So let's go ahead and connect that to there and that to there. In many ways, tapping Control and using the alternative push-pull is a slightly safer method to use. Now, I do have a slight problem here. I mean, this one has gotten a little bit ahead. So let's just connect that back to here. And again, we're going to bring this out ever so slightly, just a little dash. That'll work nicely. And I'm using inferencing to make sure that these snap to effectively the right distance. All right. And I should be able to erase this line here. And there we go. That looks pretty nice. Let's unhide everything. And I'm going to go into these groups, Control A, and we should have no problem unhiding all of these. Now, the hope is that when we bounce back to D5, when we go ahead and turn on our converter here, you should see this change reflected in your model. Yeah. And I'm going to apply the same black material that I have here to this section as well. And I think that will tie up our model. All right, let's move on. Okay, everybody, it's time to go ahead and set up our render settings. The first thing you'll notice is we've moved from the geo and sky, which I believe we use the geo and sky quite a bit in the interior render, just because it allows you to really accurately flood your scene with light. I'm going to use the HDRI instead, and you'll notice we've gone ahead and picked the midday HDRI. And one other thing that's important to do is to go to Effect and make sure that Auto Exposure is actually set to off. By default in D5, it tends to be pretty bright, which is really lovely when you're working interior scenes, and you kind of just need more light to see what you're doing. For our exterior purposes, though, I'm going to go ahead and turn off Auto Exposure entirely. Go back to our environment, and you can see I've rotated our environment so that we're getting kind of a nice area where light is falling onto our actual build. We've also got some nice shadows going on as well. We've got some lovely shadows falling from the trees that are in the scene. It may not be lit up in the most dramatic fashion, but it is more realistic. And effectively, that's what we're going for. I have, in fact, turned on the sun as well. Now, turning on the sun will basically add an additional light source. It's very similar to using the geo and sky, except you're combining the two effects, the HDRI for the overall ambient lighting and the sky, and then adding a sun in as well. And I think the results tend to be a lot better for exterior shots. We can crank up the sunlight intensity if we want to kind of overexpose the image a little bit, or just sort of blow up some of the areas, make them a little bit brighter. And the sun disk radius will determine how sharp the shadows actually are. Now again, we're going for something as close to realistic as we can get. So we want our sun disk radius. I'm going to go ahead and put it to 10. The color temperature for the sky, I've kept that in sort of default. You could probably move that a little bit to the left, but some of this color adjustment will be done in Photoshop anyway. So I think that looks pretty good. Now, using the HDRI, I believe precludes using any of the other effects, but we shouldn't really need them for this. So let's go back to Effect. And I think we're in a pretty good spot. In the next video, let's run through these additional post-production settings. So a few more things that we need to adjust. I am going to go up to our camera up here, and I'm going to turn on F8. So F8 is just going to ensure that the lines are parallel. That looks a lot better. And I'm going to hit Update Scene over here for Scene 2. Looking at the right, now that we've turned off auto exposure, we can go in and manually tweak this. So I'm going to just hide my trees, hide everything else on the Layers tab, and now I'm just going to manually move the exposure slider. Really, D5 is similar to a lot of programs. The more you have on screen, the harder the program has to work to render everything and to keep the updates relatively smooth. So I'm going to just turn off everything while I work. I know we're happy with the sky and the camera angle and the lighting. So now we're just looking at the exposure. Okay, I think that's pretty good, -21. Contrast, I'm going to leave alone. Since we're rendering really stills, we can effectively just leave this at its neutral and do this in Photoshop. Same with really the highlights. You can crank that if you want to. You can see, hopefully you can see on your monitor how it's brightening up the white. So I'm going to take that up to about 0.8. All right. Shadow and slope I'll leave, as we'll effectively change those in Photoshop. Now, the white balance is going to determine really just that, the overall warmth or coolness of your image. But for our purposes, for exteriors, I'm going to take this just ever so slightly to the left. And then for the rest, the bloom, lens flare, vignette, I'm going to leave because we are going to do these in post-production. Now, with our overall camera set up, let's go to our actual render settings. So let's go over, make sure we're on Scene 2. And again, let's go ahead and just click on Image on the top right. Okay, now we get into setting up effectively the camera part of this and setting up your export render settings. Now, I'm going to go ahead and twist my camera just a little bit, just tilt it up ever so slightly. You can always go up to Display and turn on the grid if you just need a little bit of help lining up your shot. Hit F8 on the keyboard to activate our parallel lines and hit refresh one more time. And I'm going to go ahead and set this to about 6K. Now, if you're curious, I do have a video on this on the Via Render YouTube channel. Feel free to check that one out, where I talk about which preset size to effectively use, whether to use 6 or 8K. For our purposes, since we're doing 3 different shots here, 6K represents a good compromise between high fidelity rendering and also just effective time management. The render time does get exponentially longer, and for full production, I would recommend doing a full 8K that you can then scale down. But be mindful, you're looking at an extended period of time to do an 8K render. So just keep that in mind. Now, the actual field of view here, we can tweak this a little bit, but overall, I'm still pretty happy with the default placement. Now, looking at that, I'm going to try about 85, a little lower than the 90 that we had. And I think that looks pretty good. We're getting a little bit of grass area. We're getting all of our decorative elements will appear. And you'll notice that the top of the house is not being cut off by the sky. So you maybe probably tilt that up a little bit. And I'm just going to tweak my camera. And I think that looks good. F8 again. And just do the update scene. All right, the last thing we could look at is tweaking our depth of field. I can turn that on up here, set the focus to really be on the front door of the home, and I can adjust the overall strength. So I could make it where the leaves closer to the camera are out of focus, but I'm going to leave that around 5. I don't want the image to be excessively blurry. Actually, let's even bring that down to about 3. Again, hit refresh. And now I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and I'll render this out. I'm also going to set up scenes 1 and 3 using a similar methodology. The only thing I may change there would be maybe the direction of the sun or maybe even the time of day. One last thing before we go through and render these is to ensure that you do select the channels option. And I'm going to click on this and you can see I want the mask, the ambient occlusion layer, the material ID, reflection, and transparency layers. And now that that's all done, and now that I can ensure that one last time that my parallel lines are on, yep, I'm going to hit F8 there. I think we can go ahead and render this out. I'm going to pause the video here, and when we come back, I'll have all 3 of our renders complete. All right, I'll see you in Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop. Now, I've gone ahead and picked my favorite of the 3 images, which, oddly enough, was the one from the side here. And this is the one we're going to work on in Photoshop. Now, if you've worked your way through part 1, the interior, you'll know the steps that we're going to take. So I'm going to work off the basis that you've watched that, and we'll move a little bit faster. We're not going to necessarily talk about every single thing that we're going to do. I'll just go ahead and run through the steps that I would do for this render to bring it up to what I think a professional standard is going to be. All right, first thing I'm going to do is fix up the grass. So I'm going to right click, duplicate this layer. And you can see I brought in all of my layers. Now there's a chance I'm not going to use some of these. They may just sit there, but it's good to know that we actually have them. So first thing I'm going to do is fix up the patches. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can try a number of ways to fix up these patches. And let's go ahead and just zoom in on this little guy right here first. Okay, I'm going to go to the left. I'm going to grab the clone stamp tool. And I'm going to alt click, so hold down Alt on my keyboard and just left click to target a specific area. I can make the brush a little bit larger, and I'm going to start just stamping this. Now, you can kind of see it's not necessarily like super perfect, but with your camera pulled out, I think it's good enough. And you can always go back here now. If, for example, we wanted to use the clone stamp tool again, but sample from a larger area, we can just hit Alt again and start brushing that in. And there you can see that looks pretty nice. I'm going to zoom in on this section here, and I'm going to do something similar. So you can see here now, I'm going to take my brush down a little bit, and I'll Alt click from just here to the left, and I'm going to start working this over. Alt click and stamp. And it's okay to leave a little bit of variation in there. Grass is not uniform, and so I think, 3D grass tends to be just a little bit too precise. Okay, now the area around the outer edges, let's see, can we do something similar as well? Grab our clone stamp tool, and I'm going to alt click and just sample from somewhere right here, and I'm slowly just going to dab this in there just a little bit. Now, if you had a pressure sensitive graphics tablet, this would become a little bit easier. You could kind of paint it in a little bit more organically, but I'm just using my mouse right now and just slowly adding. Here we go, a little bit more. Doesn't have to be perfect, just good enough. All right, and I think that's coming along nicely. Just a few little patches where we want this to maybe come over the road just a little bit. And again, just keep alt dabbing and sampling from other parts of your image. All right, I think that will work just fine. It'll get you mostly there. There's some other areas like just over here that could be nice to fix up, but for the most part, I think this will work. All right, that looks very nice so far. Let's move on. Okay, next thing I'm gonna do is duplicate this layer again, right click, duplicate the layer, click OK. I'm going to drag the AO or ambient occlusion layer, and I'm going to change the blend mode to this. Now I am cognizant that it's got the missing gaps in there, but that's okay. We can just go ahead and change this to overlay or one of the darken blend modes, but it's probably going to be set to overlay. You can see it's a little bit strong. Soft light will work to some degree too. Just flick through these, see what looks good. I'm going to put it on overlay, and I'm going to go ahead and drop the blend mode opacity to be pretty low. But you can see it does a good job of sort of desaturating the image and bringing a little bit more realism to it. I think that looks good at 36%. All right. Let me go ahead and grab the reflection layer, and I'm going to change this as well. Bring this into either lighten or screen. You can try really any of the additive blend modes, so lighten, screen, and the dodges. I'm going to try... Linear dodge is probably a little too strong. Let's go with the old favorite of screen, and again, drop the opacity a little bit. Now you could always paint in and out the mask here. Really, I'm just seeing it in the eaves, underneath the eaves. I think that looks good. Let's select all of these layers, right-click, duplicate the layers, click OK, and I'm going to right-click and merge those. I'm going to select all of my sort of older content, except the base layer, and put that in a group. There we go. So group 1, so just go down here and hit the little group icon. I'm going to keep my original default layer, move it up in the top of the stack, and I'll just call this the default. And type that in. Looks pretty good. And I will keep my material ID selection layer, which is this one here. If I alt-click on it, you can see it's basically just the layer that has all the ability to select the different materials from it. And that may come in handy later on. All right, next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and add a levels adjustment. Basically ask Photoshop to look at the image, analyze the image, and make sure that the lights, darks, and mid values are all within an acceptable range. There's no guarantee that my monitor is the same as yours, so let's go ahead and just click Auto and ask Photoshop to level the image. Once we've done that, we can right-click, merge down. Great, let's move on. I think that looks pretty good. Next step is to go up to Filter, and let's go back to Camera Raw. Now, this should be familiar to you if we've used any of the, watched any of the previous videos. All right, and here we are. Now, this is a great chance to look at some of really the profiles that come with Photoshop by default. So we can go ahead and go to Browse here. And you can see we've got some basic ones. We've got some black and white that we're probably unlikely to use. But the ones that I'm interested in are the modern ones. And you can see when we hover over these, the Camera Raw preview will actually update to show you what the effect is going to be. Now, I wish there was an ideal way to say just use this one and everything will be fine, but there really isn't. And so what you're looking for is something that really boosts some of the values. Now, I'm liking 9 and I'm liking 6. So what we could do, actually, let's do 9 and 8 seem to give a nice compromise. Let's click 8 first and click OK. And what I'll actually do is, let's do this. Let's duplicate this layer. And we're actually going to duplicate it. So now we've got our original older default. Now we've got 3 identical layers here, 1, 2, and 3. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this one fine. And this layer, the second one, I'm going to go Filter, Camera Raw. And what we'll actually do is blend between these two. So Browse, and the ones that we really liked were 8 and 9. So I'm going to click on 8, leave it at 100%, and click OK. And you can see that has applied now to this layer. On this layer, the third one at the very top, I'm going to go Filter, Camera Raw Filter. And this time I'm going to blend between, I'm going to grab the 9th one. And again, go to Profile, Browse, Modern, 9, and click OK. All right, lovely stuff. Now, both of these have similar-ish effects. Get rid of that. And I'm just going to blend between the two and just sort of see what I like. So I'm going to turn this one on, and I'm actually going to move that to the top. Let's mess with number 9 first. So I'm going to rename this to 9, and I'll rename the one above it to 8. Okay. And so 9 does a really nice job, but I'm going to drop the opacity of this to about 50. So I'm getting a mixture of the original. We'll call this one BKG. So this will be our new NEW and BKG, new background. And then 9 is set to about 60%, and 8 I'm going to set to about 50 as well. All right, that looks really nice. And so what I'm going to do then is select all of these, duplicate them, click OK, and merge them down. So now this is my new working background. I can go ahead and just hide all the rest, put them in another group, don't need them anymore. And now this is going to be our original default. And then there we go, the slightly blended one. You can see it already looks substantially better. Let's go ahead and duplicate that one more time. And now we'll go in and really tweak this with Camera Raw. Okay, let's go back to our old friend, Camera Raw, up at the top here. Okay, and now it's time to really go in here and tweak this image. Now, the exposure value I think is probably good. I may take down the contrast just a little bit and just see how that works. And bearing in mind, you know, there's no ultra magical ideal button to find the right color values or grading. It really is just kind of work. All right, I'm going to grab these highlights. You can see the highlight being the white. And I'm actually going to take it down a little bit. Looking at the shadows, maybe just take them down too a little bit too. We can adjust the overall white value. And you can see by cranking that to the right, you can see how it blows out the image quite a lot. So let's take it just a little bit to the left. And the blacks are going to do just the same. You can see there by cranking these either way, you can see the effect that you're actually getting. I'll leave the black value really where it was. I think it's pretty okay. There we go. All right, texture, clarity, and dehaze. I am going to add a little bit of texture, just a dash, and just a little bit of dash of the clarity too. And take the dehaze slider, you can see by cranking it to the left, we get almost an actual haze value. And by taking it to the right, you can see things become a little bit more saturated. But you can see up here on the top on the histogram, the changes that that's going to actually have to the image. And you can see by taking it to the left here, we get a very overly sort of white image. And taking it to the right, really we're getting pronounced dark areas. So I'm just going to move this a little, just a little bit to the left. We'll give it a slight dreamy quality. Vibrance and saturation. Let's take up the vibrance and take down the saturation just a bit. And then with the vibrance slider, we can now bring this back to a more reasonable amount. And it's just, I think it's just a nice technique. Real life is not as saturated as computer-generated imagery. And so you can take up the vibrance, make colors look more vibrant, but take away a little bit the saturation. And I think that already looks a little bit better. Okay, one of my favorite things to mess with recently has been this curve slider. Now, I've really just started using this very recently, so I'm not completely familiar with all the ins and outs, but it does represent a nice graphical interface for grabbing the highlights, light starks, and the shadows. And you can see it happening sort of in real time. As we move the slider, you can see those changes being updated. And so what I might do is look for something that's a little bit more dramatic. I might crank up some of the darks a little bit, and we'll tweak the shadows. Maybe we'll make them quite dark in the darkest spots. I think that looks pretty good. Moving on, I'm going to ignore the detail and the color mixture. I think overall I'm pretty happy with the color breakdown of this image. I may just crank up a little bit some of the red, just a tiny amount. But this is very much going to depend on your image. I'll take down the luminance so they're not super bright either. We could adjust the green of the grass if we wanted to make it a little bit more green. But I do think, again, CG grass tends to be very, very pronounced. So let's actually mess with these just a little bit. Make it a little bit maybe darker and leave the saturation where it is. Okay, that looks really, really nice. I think we're in a good spot here. And looking at the histogram, I don't see anything that's overly too strong. Maybe the whites are probably a little bit blown out, just a dash here. But again, you know, you're going for a white home. I think this is acceptable. I would consider this quite acceptable. Let me adjust the saturation a bit more. Okay, looks good. Click OK. Now we can toggle. You can see this is our original default here. This is the layer that had all the color changes. And this is the one that we've just adjusted. Now, the one that we just adjusted came out a little bright. So let's select it and drop this down to about 73. Okay, I'm going to make a copy of my original duplicate. And you don't have to do this. This is just sort of how I work with this. And I'm going to lift that right up there. And again, right click and merge these down. All right, let's add some finishing touches. Okay, a couple of finishing touches. Duplicate the layer that we were just on. When in doubt, duplicate away. I'm going to zoom in. Now, this corner seems very, very sharp to me. It's a little too sharp. I probably should have turned on the edges option in D5. So what I'm going to do is go to my blur tool. I'm going to drop the brush size quite low, and I'm going to hold down Shift, and again, holding down Shift, just left click all the way to here. And you can see that's gone ahead and blurred that edge quite nicely. Do the same over here. We're getting, again, just left click, hold down Shift, and click again. And the same over here. I just want to make sure that the outer edges of the building are not super sharp. Now, we could do that on the roof too as well, maybe on this side of the roof, but I think just doing it there makes it look pretty nice. Okay, I'm going to duplicate this one more time, and what I'm going to do is go up to Filter. We're going to go Other and High Pass. And the High Pass is going to give us that sharpening layer. Go ahead and click OK. Very gray looking. But we can change the blend mode to Overlay. And if we zoom in on an area of fidelity, you can see the difference there. So off, on, off, and on. Looks nice. Drop that down a little bit if it's too sharp. Right click and merge it down again. Yeah, I think okay. That looks pretty sweet to me. I think we can work with that. And a couple of other things we may want to do is tweak maybe the depth of field a little bit. So I'm going to go and select the Material ID map layer. It's going to be this one. Hit W on the keyboard to bring up the magic wand tool and make sure that it is set to tolerance of around 15. And I'm going to sample right here. All right, that looks good. Now, with that done, I'm going to right click and duplicate this layer one more time. And I'm going to go Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And 6.8 is a little strong, but because it's on its own layer, I can drop that opacity down. Okay, you can see it if we zoom in a little bit on the leaves here. And that's it off, and that's it on. And it's just a small thing, but I think it'll help with the image. So Control D. And it's probably still too strong, so we dial this back manually. That looks nice. And one other thing I'm going to do is actually grab the blur tool itself, blur tool, and this is going to work as a brush. Scale up my brush quite large, and I'm just going to left click and just drag this over just some of the outer edges here, just very softly, just ever so slightly blurring the edges here. Yeah, I think that will work. Okay. Now, all in all, I'm pretty happy with this. Right click, merge this down. And since we're in a pretty good spot right now, it could be a good idea to really just select everything. And I think we can go ahead and flatten our image. I'm going to do one more pass in Camera Raw, but I think we're pretty close to being done. So let's go ahead and duplicate these. Merge these again. Like I said, when in doubt, just duplicate away. You're going to flatten it anyway, so don't worry about working with all these extra layers. And I think I'm going to just bounce back up to Camera Raw one last time. So if we go back to Filter and Camera Raw Filter, and these will be our final edits that we're going to make. And I'm again just going to go back to Browse, and I'm just going to look at some of the modern again. And now what I don't want to do is run these at full strength. This is merely just tweaking values, really just based on the templates that we have. And I think in terms of sort of going for realism and going for something a little more desaturated, I'm going to click on Modern 8 again, but I am going to just bring down the values ever so slightly. I think that will work very nicely for us. And then we can go back up to Filter, and we're going to go to Lens Correction. Click on Custom, and I'm going to add ever so slightly, just the smallest amount of distortion, and I'm going to add a very small dash of chromatic aberration. Just go to the Fix Red or Cyan Fringe and just turn that on and click OK. And with that being said, I'm going to right click and flatten the image, and I'm going to pull my camera just out a little bit. There we go. And all in all, I think if we take a look at this, you know, just sort of can't pull the camera back out, I'm overall very happy with this. If we had a little bit more time, there's a couple more tweaks that I would do. I might actually change out the sky here using Adobe's AI sky replacement. But all in all, I think for commercial property renders, this one will do just fine. With that being said, this course is now officially over. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time. If you enjoyed the content, please think about leaving a review. It greatly helps with, really getting the course out there and getting people watching and participating. And if you didn't like the course, feel free to shoot me an email, either through Udemy or maybe through Gumroad or through the viarender@gmail.com, and provide some feedback. Other than that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great time, and please feel free to share your renders and your work and reach out to me if you want any assistance. All right, that's it for me. Cheers.